Hello and welcome back to another Sponge review. My name is Jim, I'm the owner of Sponge GOT. I'm a teacher, trainer, manager and blogger. And this is our second review. It feels like I'm doing these far too quickly. Today I'm going to be reviewing this. Michael Lewis's The Lexical Approach, A State of EOT and the Way Forward. You can see that I've been doing a bit of reading. This is how my books usually look after I've been through and read them. I'm a massive fan of highlighting and taking notes and going back and reviewing stuff. So I hope I'm not looking bad in anyone's eyes there. Okay, so a bit of background. Why did I pick up this book? Well, on the NILMA that I'm doing at the moment, one of the assignments was focused on, basically it asked us to create a set of materials that taught or raised awareness of a certain set of target language or pieces of language. And I didn't want to focus on grammar because I very much believe against sort of prescriptively teaching grammar. And I was warned against focusing on phonology, even though phonology is something that I like, although I admit that I need to learn and become more confident with. And so I was left to more Lexis. Obviously there's discourse as a system, but Lexis was the one that I wanted to focus on. And so to cut a long story short, I focused on Lexis and I chose some pieces of formulaic language. And one of the pieces of reading that I was obviously recommended was the Lexical Approach. And now, I've read a lot about the Lexical Approach over the years, right? I think all of us that have either taken Delta or TESOL or have read something in sort of a language teaching magazine. I even think that they push it on certain social courses now. We've heard of the Lexical Approach. It's massively influenced quite a lot of things within our industry, including coursebook writing, materials writing, this sort of thing, and language pedagogy. So, I've always been interested in it, but this is the first time that I took the plunge, per se, and got into the actual book. So what follows here is pretty much my review of the Lexical Approach. And let's get into it. Okay, so a quick summary. Forgive me if I look at my notes. Basically, the Lexical Approach was a book that was written in 2002, and Lewis kind of came out and just destroyed this idea, or tried to destroy this idea that language is basically grammar and then there's lexis put inside it. So his principle, if you will, or one of the principles of the Lexical Approach is the idea that language is grammaticalized lexis, in the sense that within language you have words, and these words have their individual pieces of grammar. So rather than looking at grammar as determining everything, which obviously there's still that generative sort of thing that we have there. But he asked us to look at language like at sort of, if we're looking at a word, we need to look at the grammar that goes with that word specifically, and teach and present in that way. The book itself starts for example at the principles, looks at the philosophy, then looks at how a language is viewed, and then looks at some of the pedagogical things, such as how corrective feedback or error correction comes in, the role of teachers and teacher trainers, materials, these sorts of things. Okay, so very brief summary. Another thing to add to this summary, I suppose, is it's quite dense. Yeah, it's quite dense. There's a lot of philosophical stuff at the start, but in general, it's worth a read. Okay, so let's go a bit deeper. If you've read my blog and you've seen my reviews, you'll know that I do a thing called 3 takeaways. Well, I do a few things actually. I do things like 3 sentences summary, 3 takeaways, what I liked, what I didn't like, blah, 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 blah. Right, well, let's focus on the 3 takeaways. So my first one is language is grammaticalized lexis. I think this is, for me, one of the biggest takeaways. I'd heard this phrase, if you will, in many places. I think most of us have, but I don't think I really fully understood it until I'd actually read the Lexical Approach. And as I mentioned in the summary, we're looking at a word, for example, I don't know, kite, and we look at how kite is used in various contexts. And if we're thinking about grammar, okay, because, and I'll talk about another takeaway in a sec, but we're looking at word grammar, but there's also sentence grammar, and this is where we look at things such as, if we're still looking within the same sentence, we can look at other things like he calls them institutionalized expressions or sentences. And basically these are almost complete sentences, but they have like one pragmatic meaning or a number of pragmatic meanings. And so we should be learning them not as, the present perfect or the past perfect or conditionals. He's very, very, very critical of like the conditionals and recorded speech, things like that. Okay, right. So I'm gonna read a quote, and then we'll move on to the next one. Grammar is the search for powerful patterns. Historically, this has led to what Willis calls an inordinate attention being paid to the verb phrase. But many other items within the more strictly grammatical side of the syllabus deserve increased attention within the lexical approach. So, this is my next takeaway. Basically, grammar is involved in the lexical approach, and that came as a bit of a surprise to me. So there are certain sets of grammar, or certain pieces of grammar, which Lewis views as worthwhile, basically worth attention or time spent on focusing a learner's attention or raising awareness of. And he views certainly grammar as a receptive skill, okay? So which is quite interesting. And so some of the things that he wants us to raise awareness of in our learners are things like basic morphology and word formation, like past endings and things like that, that can kind of be generalized. Auxiliary manipulation, which is quite interesting, so looking at how auxiliaries can convey different meanings. Now he raises this because that they contribute to the meaning of what he calls 6 major functions: expressing negatives, questions, tags, making short answers, interesting responses, and adding emphasis to what is said. Okay, so that's quite interesting. Oppositions, negation, adjuncts. He calls grammatical hollow phrases as lexis, so basically those institutionalized sentences or expressions that I was talking about before, that we can kind of learn as one chunk. And this idea of I need to get the pronunciation right, suprasentential linking, and basically that means that we're linking outside of one sentence. So one of Lewis's biggest criticisms of at the time, but I would even say even now, is that much of our teaching, especially with grammar, focuses at the sentence level. When grammar is, if we're thinking about the context and the co-text, the language that goes around within the same text, then grammar is used to hold all of that together, link things, not necessarily only at the at the word or the sentence level. Okay, so we're looking at sort of the discourse level there. Okay, right. Another takeaway: language should be presented, practiced, and recorded, although through an observe, hypothesize, and experiment paradigm. Okay, so I'm going to talk about what I liked in a second. I'm going to focus on PPP there. But he presents this new paradigm, which is new at the time, I suppose: observe, hypothesize, and experiment. One of the things that he wants us to do is present language to learners as chunks, as collocations, but allow them to engage with it and identify the word grammar. Okay, so kind of like guided discovery, if you will. So we're presenting a list of collocations, and then we're thinking, okay, how do these words collocate with other words? what are some of the things that is unique to this word, and these sorts of things. So that's the observe, and then they're going to hypothesize, and then we're going to experiment and try and use them in some activities. So one of the things that he actually says is good is this decontextualized practice, and things like certain types of gap fills that are within an actual text, which is quite interesting, because I'm not sure how much of a fan I am of that, but that would be one of the major takeaways for me. And along with that is this idea that language needs to be recorded. Now, he is very much against the sort of the standard vocabulary book where we sort of just write things down in a linear fashion, or even in an alphabetical fashion, and which I agree with. I think that's not the best way to record vocabulary. He kind of wants us to do in a non-linear fashion. He gives a few examples, a little bit vague, but basically we could do like mind maps. We could organize them by functions or by themes, or at the word level. So, for example, with take, all the collocations that we can form with take, take the bus, other things like that. Can't think of anything else at the moment. Okay, so what did I like about this book? There's a lot that I liked actually, and I can't believe that I haven't read it before now. The first thing, that it's old but still relevant. I said before I think I said that it was sort of out to the public in 2002. That was wrong. Sorry, it's 1993. Just double checked. And 1993. That's a long time ago. I mean, I was born in 1991. And so I can imagine that at the time, this must have been revolutionary. But even now, especially as a trainer or a teacher educator, as well as a director of studies, and also with working in external or carrying out external workshops, a lot of what I see still with teachers is still very much looking at that sentence grammar, or grammar above everything else. And so Lewis's ideas in here, I think, are excellent. And I mean, one of the things in there that he says is that Lexis is pretty much superior to grammar, which I loved. And another thing that I liked is that he openly criticizes the PPP paradigm, like, a lot. Now, I'm not going to say that using PPP as in a one-off thing is wrong. What I'm saying, though, is, and what he's saying, is that using this as a sort of method or approach it goes against what we know about second language acquisition, and furthermore, it puts too much emphasis on production, especially at lower levels, which we know is not exactly what they need. Okay, so I'll let you have a read over that and look at the criticisms, but it's throughout the whole book. All right. Another thing that I like is that he states that there's no one method, okay, which I love. Obviously, we're thinking about eclecticism here, but he has a warning about eclecticism, and he says that that it's kind of a word that's thrown around as an excuse for confusion. Was his word, confusion? From my own experience, it's an excuse for not knowing the underlying principles of what you're doing. And I know this was at a time when eclecticism was around, and the idea of principled eclecticism came later. But and this has been echoed by other authors and pedagogues, if you will, within EOT. So I thought that was great. Within the book, he talks about sort of task-based methodology, not specifically task-based language teaching, but he talks about task-based methodology, and saying this is the type of methodology that he would recommend in conjunction sort of with the lexical approach. Right. Going back to what I was speaking about, the lower levels, another thing that I liked is he says he emphasizes receptive skills for lower levels. So we know from a plethora of research that lower levels, especially with children, they need massive amounts of exposure to English, and a lot of it needs to be kind of understandable. Not always, though. But the idea is that a lot of teachers have is, and he talks about his experiences in here, is that we need to get them to produce. We need to get lower levels to produce. Now, production is certainly important. I mean, there are things like sort of the output hypothesis, interaction hypothesis. You know, there's a lot there that we need to, in which production is super important. But at the lower levels, we should be working with receptive skills first and allowing for those silent periods. So that's something that I liked about that. And he doesn't go too in depth into sort of into language development and the intricacies of interlanguage overall, but he asks us to be aware of learners' development stages and work with their internal syllabus. So he wants us to, or he wants teachers to sort of take a different vision of language teaching and not see it as this additive process where we're just adding features of language and putting them there, okay? Because that's not how we learn, right? There was also a really nice activity that he did. He doesn't present too many activities in the book, but one of the activities is, and I'm going to put it on the screen now, is he asks, basically the activity asks learners to respond or to agree or disagree, but in a lexical way. And I thought that was really, really interesting. I liked it. And he has a number of these activities, and then he talks about, or he brings in research in terms of, or research from discourse analysis and spoken grammar, which I thought was excellent. Like, yes, that's what I want to see. And so he brought that in, and you know, in this case, you know, research shows that we often respond with agreement or disagreement lexically as opposed to grammatically, and so I thought that was really interesting. So there were a number of really nice activities in there that you can see how you could use them in class, which I thought was great. My last point for what I liked is it focuses on published materials. Lewis is quite critical of them, saying that they're often very structural, and at the time that they probably were. Now there's a big change within coursebook materials, but what about teaching? I still think much of teaching nowadays is, I mean, you look on YouTube and you look at all the videos that are presented there for learners, and they're all pretty much structurally based. And what he was saying with materials specifically is that these obviously need to change, but they have value in the classroom as tools. Pretty much because he thinks that teachers, the majority of the time, teacher-created materials are terrible. He says it in a different way, but basically that's what he's saying. And that's because there are loads of constraints on teachers, such as time, you know, resources to actually create them, the ability to create them, understanding of, you know, acquisition, and things that go into creating materials that coursebook writers perhaps need to know about. So he says, use the coursebook, use it, but supplement it, omit things that are not relevant, you know, these sorts of things. So it's a sort of more judicious use of the coursebook than just take it and here it is. Right, what didn't I like? Right, there are loads of things in this book that I love, but there are a few things that I thought were a little bit strange. So, the first one, it reads like a manifesto at the start, at least for the first 100 pages, which, you know, I didn't mind it. I think as teacher educators and teachers, as we become more advanced in our career and we start to explore these different areas, I think it's important to look at the philosophical underpinnings of certain methods and approaches and understand the thinking behind them. But I can imagine an early career teacher picking this up, getting into page 20 or 30 and being like, what, where is this going? Okay, so So that could be a barrier for teachers that haven't sort of experimented or read about sort of the philosophical aspect of language teaching and other places. I mean, when I read this, it reminded me of Long's SLA in task-based language teaching, which there are like maybe 3 or 4 chapters in there, which are like full on the philosophy and the philosophical underpinnings of the approach. You know, so it's a lot to take in. It's worth it, but just be advised that it's there. Yeah. Another point. You know, I read a lot of books, and at times I felt like I was stupid because I had to read a number of the paragraphs again and again for me to understand what they were saying. And so I think if I'm being honest, I think at times Lewis writes in a way that's quite dense for me. Maybe you find it really easy to read, but there were times where I didn't think it was reading. Like the way that I was reading it, it wasn't very conversational. It was very much but literature almost, but going a little bit deeper. And so I found that a little bit off-putting, if you will. What else have I got in here? Okay, I mentioned before that there are some activities and things involved. However, there are not many, right? So there's a load of information in this book. And combine that with the examples that are given for a real classroom, and I would say there's a massive imbalance. So, I mean, if I would have one sort of criticism of it that I think should be changed immediately, would be to have more activities in there, yeah? My last point is, I have to take into consideration when this book was written, yeah? But the focus on corrective feedback in here, so on error correction, right? And basically Lewis says that there's no research that shows that corrective feedback is beneficial. And obviously nowadays we know that, you know, over the past 45 years of research, we've collected enough data to say that corrective feedback is helpful. There's not much agreement on the specific types of techniques at times, but we know that explicit is generally better than implicit, and there are certain techniques around that are more researched than others. So, for example, recast are quite heavily researched. So I didn't agree with him on that, but again, this was written in 1993. Okay, the way that he says that teachers should respond to feedback, we shouldn't correct, but we should respond, is by reformulation. Now, I think reformulation or recasting is a great technique, but it's very implicit, and there come, you know, a lot of the times that these occur in class, learners don't actually see them as corrections, and they may not recognize that, and they may not notice what's going on. So that, I suppose, would be my last criticism. Okay, so for me, applying it to my practice, okay, so, you know, this section in my blog is focused on me specifically, not on you guys, but I hope that you create your own, right? Applying it to my practice. There are 2 things that I think I would like to incorporate into my practice. I've got them here. Number 1 is more word grammar, but exploring the word in the moment. So I'm very much a focus on form guy. I don't know if you can say that, but I'm going to say it. I'm a focus on form guy. So as learner language needs arise, I deal with them, and I exploit these sort of dealing with emergent language, right? But what I would like to do, and I did the other day, and I'm going to give you an example in a second, is, you know, at that moment or just after or later in the lesson, is explore some of that language and look at the word grammar and get learners to record that. So the other day in class, I was with 2 B2 learners, and the word stain or mancha in manchar in Spanish came up, and they didn't. They were completing an info gap, and so they had to describe 2 pictures, and there was a stain on a shirt in one of them, and the word came up, and so I provided it to them, to one of the learners, and they were able to complete the task. After the task, I then bordered the word stain, and we looked at different collocations and they were able to, identify some of the patterns with it, which I thought was really interesting. And then after, they recorded it in like a mind map in their book. So I'd like to do more of this, rather than just boarding the collocation as it comes up, and that's what I usually do. I'd like to, if there's time, take that opportunity to look at, building a list of collocations with that word and getting them to identify the word grammar there. The second one is, so Lewis, he's very much for providing even even the lowest level learners with these institutionalized sentences or expressions, because they convey massive amounts of communicative power. And I agree with him. So I think re-envisaging my approach to teaching sort of very low-level learners, the idea of presenting them with these chunks of language, and they need to be unanalyzed, which is really, really important, because this generative aspect of grammar and working with language comes later. But presenting them as unanalyzed chunks, I think, is something that's really, really important. So that's what I'm going to start to do more of when I'm working with low-level learners. So who should read this book? Okay, teachers, number one. Teachers out there should definitely read this. Go pick it up, okay? Go pick it up. Just be aware of the philosophical aspect of it, which I think is good to go into, but just be prepared for it, right? So teachers should definitely be picking this up. If you're doing a Delta or a Dip TESOL or an MA in TESOL or language teaching, this is going to be really, really useful. But you may not have the time it takes to read it. So if you don't have the time, although you find the time, but if you don't have the time, I recommend reading the first chapter in there. It's the Principles and Implications of a Lexical Approach. Okay, it's 2 pages, and then there's about 8 or 9 pages at the back. I think it's the last chapter. Let's have a look. Teacher training and methodological implications. Okay, so these 2 chapters, if you will, give you sort of a great overview of the lexical approach and the vital things that you need to know. So very, very useful for you guys. Right, teacher educators, we should definitely be reading this, not only for understanding the lexical approach in more detail, but in engaging in those discussions with teachers about their view of language and how they're presenting language. I think this provides some really, really nice points to bring into the conversation. Syllabus designers. All right, in the book, Lewis talks about, the lexical approach is not a syllabus. Okay, so he goes against, I think it was Willis that wrote the lexical syllabus, right? I'm not saying that this is going to help you plan syllabi, but what it will do, it will help you sort of, hopefully, take a different vision on the aspect of the structural syllabus. Now, if sort of the modern day syllabus planners, they're already clued in on this, but if you're not, I highly recommend reading it and just getting a different perspective on the view of language, if you will. And my last one would be for materials writers. If you're writing materials, even for course books or just other materials in general, this will provide some really, really great insight into, how we might better view language as language teachers. Okay, so that's my review of Lexical Approach. It was a read. I mean, it's 200 pages. It took me a good few weeks to go through and, get my notes together and things like that. It's worth it. I highly recommend it. But be aware that there's the philosophical aspect. You go quite deep into it, and Lewis writes a little bit densely, at least he does for me. The one thing I will say is that you come away from the Lexical Approach with so many questions, especially about implementation. And this is why, I'm assuming, Lewis wrote Implementing the Lexical Approach, which is another book, which I have at home, but I don't have time to read. Now, in the blog, I've left a few links. And I think it's Aaron O'Brien, I think that's how you pronounce her name, Aaron O'Byrne, sorry. And she has this amazing podcast, Everything EFL. And I think she has like 70 episodes at the moment. But she has two of them, which are really interesting. Two of them are with Hugh Deller, and they're talking about the Lexical Approach, or how to implement it. So I highly recommend checking that out if you don't have the time, so sit down and read the book. So in the blog post, I'll leave links for them, okay? Right guys, that's it from me. If you do read this, let me know your thoughts, whether in the comments or get in touch. If you have any other recommendations apart from implementing the Lexical Approach, please let me know. I'm sort of reading a lot of stuff now at the moment, so I don't think I'll have time to get to implementing the Lexical Approach, at least not this year, but it is on my to-do list for the future, okay? So like I said, if you've read it or you know something about it, get in touch and let's chat, all right? All right guys, thank you very much for watching. Take care and we'll see you soon. Bye.